Hi, everybody. Welcome back. This is episode 4 of This Is Who We Are. My name is Steve Greenfield. I'd like to thank you for joining. Just before we get started, a little quick reminder if you like what I'm doing here, please subscribe to the Facebook page down there in the lower right hand corner below the screen. Like the Facebook page, share this information with your friends. How they can access these broadcasts if you happen to live within the broadcast radius of a Pacifica Radio Network affiliate, please give them a call and ask them to download and broadcast this show. Some stations are picking it up, but I really need some help region by region in helping to get it nationwide, getting the word out. For those of you who are just joining, I'm up to episode 4 already. I encourage you to watch or listen to the first 3 episodes. But I'll briefly just bring up once again how the title of this show was chosen, how it relates to what I'm hoping is the intent of this program, what's going to make it different from the other online public affairs commentary that you've probably seen. I chose the title because as I was preparing to record the first episode, we unfortunately had to bear witness to the horrifying events in the attack on the United States Capitol, which was mounted by a small group of people in their hope that they would be able to stop the Senate from certifying the election and keep that process open long enough to overturn the result and keep Donald Trump as the president, despite the fact that as far as anything visible and was certified by all states, whether they were Democrat or Republican governed states, that the vote totals were accurate, that fraud was not present, and that each electoral college from each state got together, the electors, and cast their votes legitimately according to the constitutional process. In the aftermath of that, there were a lot of words, I suppose, intended to be of comfort to us by Joe Biden, by Republican leaders, by McCarthy, that this isn't who we are, that what we were seeing on TV that day isn't who we are. And I really couldn't make it past those words to listen to the rest of whatever words of comfort these leaders were going to try to provide. Because if that was the premise, then the premise is false, because this definitely is who we are. It's always been who we are. And, if you start your argument with a false premise, then everything that follows that premise is also going to be false. There's no point in debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin if there's no such thing as an angel, right? The conclusions that you reach in such a debate is not of any purpose. And so I chose the name of this show and realized that I was going to, in order to achieve my purpose of what I'm trying to do here, which is to view the critical issues that face this country in a non-tribal way, in a non-partisan way. In fact, to go that extra step and to view them in an anti-partisan way, so that some hope can arise, that we can move forward on some of the important issues, all these sticking points, these things that are essential to the future of the United States, that we refuse to budge on because we've had ourselves directed more towards hostility that we feel towards each other in these two heavily ritualized, heavily mythologized political encampments, that we seem obligated to choose which one of them we more identify with, and then gradually find our own consciousness about issues becoming slowly altered and bent to increasing strictures that are placed within each of those party contexts about what we have to believe and what we, at the very least, have to support and go along with, even if we're not all that sure whether we believe it, or all that excited about whether it's even one of the more critical issues that we're facing. And so we have to remember that this country was founded by a small number of people who engaged in violence against a much more powerful governing force. That is the founding mythology of this country. That is what we celebrate every July 4th and believe defines us as a people and makes us different from all the other countries in the world. That this was the first time in history that a settled colony of a parent country separated itself and formed an entirely new country. And so how did we do that? We didn't do that by democratic means. We did that by a small group of armed people, of armed white people, quite frankly, against an overwhelming organized governmental force and its combined military power. And then we moved from there you know, to trying to form ourselves together as a nation. And from 1783, the official end of that war, of the Revolutionary War, through 1789, with the Articles of Confederation, there was violence throughout this new country. Rebellions constantly and unable to be quelled because the original articles did not provide for sufficient executive authority in the limited federal government to respond to this violence. And so we got back together again in 1787 through 1789 in the aftermath of Shays' Rebellion specifically to see if we could start over and at least find a way to give the federal government enough power to quell rebellions. That's really all that was happening. You have to go back to your childhood American history. They were trying to provide the minimum amount of additional federalism that would allow for quelling rebellions while still retaining the idea that the states themselves were largely sovereign and independent from each other. And even within that context, that we were divided then as now into two principal encampments with two differing sets of values, two different economic systems, and that we would be grafted around basically a free trade and a mutual defense agreement, and that would be the extent of how we viewed ourselves centrally. There was, in fact, never a common purpose, never a common mission, other than having free trade among ourselves and the ability to combine together to repel invasions and to quell rebellions. Internally. Fascinating thing about that, solution that we supposedly achieved is that, the Whiskey Rebellion broke out almost immediately in the aftermath, very short order in the aftermath of that. So, it obviously didn't work, right out of the starting gate, this attempt to create a new constitution, specifically to quell rebellion. Was a failure. And it wasn't so much a failure in quelling rebellion, but it was a failure in convincing the American people that rebellion was not a way of life for us, that rebellion against our own government through force of arms, was not a way of life for us. It remained a way of life for us, throughout the time, and all the compromises going up to the Civil War itself, the aftermath of the end of Reconstruction, the Red Shirts, the Klan, many overthrown elections. This has gone on, right through the Bundy Ranch, in 2014. Another armed tax rebellion by someone who believed that he was a sovereign citizen and not part of the United States. And many politicians of the United States government, came to that site to make appearances on television to show their support to that notion. Boy, what a paradox there. Someone who was using force of arms to convey that he felt he was a sovereign citizen and not under American governmental jurisdiction. And many members of the American government went out there to stand alongside him, while many private militia individuals, took up arms on an overpass, on an elevated position, training their weapons on law enforcement officials. Not unlike what we saw at the Capitol grounds just a few years later. So this really is who we are. If we don't wrap our heads around the idea that this is who we are, then we're never going to be able to start rooting around for whatever tools or creating whatever new tools we might need to see if we could finally bring this country to just enough of a degree of recognizing what common purpose we have as so to be able to work with each other to solve those problems. So, if you listen to the first three episodes, if you go back to listen to the first three episodes, I went through, many cases of this kind of violence that's happened in our history. For those of you who are watching on video, if you'll forgive me for a moment for glancing over to the side at notes and not be able to look directly at the camera for a second. Just as a quick reminder, Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, Bleeding Kansas, John Brown's Rebellion and the Harper's Ferry Raid, the Red Shirts in the South and the election of 1876, and that suspended election, which was resolved in the aftermath of violence. The actual overthrow of the elected government of Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. the massive white assault in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, coming up on its 100th anniversary, when what was sometimes referred to as Black Wall Street was attacked and destroyed. Hundreds of black people killed and an entire section of a city burned to the ground. In the 20th century, we saw federal troops have to repeatedly be sent into the South to enforce the integration of the school system. In the year 2000, we saw the Brooks Brothers riot in Florida that forced the stopping of the counting of the election in 2000. That actually was probably the most dramatically successful forceful rebellion in American history, because it actually did overturn the election. It prevented finishing the counting of those Florida ballots, which when later counted by newspapers showed that Gore had actually won Florida and therefore had won the presidency. I'm going to return to that in a few minutes, a little bit later. And the aforementioned Bundy Ranch in 2014. So this really has been a continuum. And by the way, this is by no means a comprehensive list. It was never my intention to have a history of American armed rebellion broadcast that I was going here. It really just kind of came up because of what our national leaders were saying at the time of our most recent forceful rebellion, and that we need to demythologize and recognize what this country has been, how this country was founded, who we've been continuously this whole time. I guess I'm getting redundant in saying that too many times. Today, I'm going to talk about something that's also not in the media, but also was a pretty contemporary rebellion. It happened in 1954, specifically on March 1st, 1954, in the chamber of the House of Representatives. The violent people actually entered the chamber. They entered the gallery, the visitors' gallery above the floor. 4 people, Puerto Rican nationalists, and pulled out firearms and shot down onto the floor and shot 5 congressmen, wounding them. One of them critically. This was a real event. I encourage everybody, Google that. 1954 shooting in Congress. Puerto Rican nationalists. Go on YouTube. There's a great newsreel video that is just under the title March 1st, 1954 shooting in Congress. Put that into the search bar and call up that video and watch it in glorious newsreel black and white, as was sent throughout the United States when that happened. Yes, this actually happened. Do you know that? Maybe I had that in the back of my head. I hadn't really thought about it in years. In 1954, armed people entered the gallery of the chamber of the House of Representatives and were able to fire down on the floor and shoot, and luckily not kill any, but did shoot and wound 5 of them. So there we are. This isn't who we are. And what was that violence about? Again, a divisive matter before the government. That the status quo at that moment was making people angry and unhappy that they couldn't get the thing that they were seeking through the democratic process as designed in this country. And so I am going to actually stop again and go back one more time to the Constitution of the United States and how it was created to set aside any element of democracy that could eventually end slavery. The southern states were given enormous concessions in favor of minority rule over this new country as a way of making sure that the thing they cared about the most, which was protecting their quasi-feudalistic economy, agrarian economy, with aristocrats owning human beings as property and compelling their labor, and restricting their motion and holding them prisoner and captive, could never be voted out of a growing nation by democratic means. The 3/5 compromise gave slave owners 60% more voting strength than non-slave owners. Boy, what an incentive to acquire even more and more slaves. They were given the 2-seat Senate. and that both chambers would have to agree with each other so that decisions could not be made in the legislative branch by popular vote, as is done in a parliamentary system. This was an extremely critical thing because it turned out that the electoral college system that we were using to elect presidents included the congressional delegation as well as the 2 seats in the Senate. And so the smaller the state, the larger the impact of those 2 Senate seats on presidential elections. If you're in, Vermont right now or Wyoming, you only have 1 member of Congress because your population is so low. But you have 2 senators because that's guaranteed. So inviolable is this minority rule component of the 2 seat per state Senate. Another thing they didn't teach us in school. That is the one part of the United States Constitution that is prohibited in the Constitution itself from ever being changed by amendment. Check it out. That's true. I'm noticing that I just reached just about the quarter hour mark here, and so I'm just going to chime in with a kind of program ID. You're listening or watching This Is Who We Are, a nonpartisan and anti-partisan public affairs commentary program. My name is Steve Greenfield. I do this for 58 minutes once a week, and I'm glad to have you down here. So again, back to where I just left off about how we actually refused to join together as a country on the basis of democracy, that we joined together on the basis of substantial minority rule, and expressly for one purpose, to make sure that we could never apply democratic processes to end slavery. If slavery was going to end, it was going to end through violence, which of course is how it ultimately ended. And so, kind of with the Puerto Rican nationalists who were seeking the independence of our colony, because let's face it, that's what it is. We acquired it during the Spanish-American War, along with the Philippines and Cuba. Like we've liberated, pretty much all the other places that we captured from Spain in that war, but we've retained Puerto Rico. And so those nationalists were really using the only form of redress that our non-democratic, anti-democratic constitutional system had left them with. Regardless of whether anybody approves of that, because that's not the debate that I'm here to have on this particular show. We probably don't approve of what just happened at the Capitol on January 6th, but I'm going to bet that an awful lot of people that are listening to this program right now definitely think that John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry and his attempt to capture enough armaments to provide for a slave rebellion and overthrow the governments of the South was a good thing. I mean, check yourself there, pal. I think you probably think that one was good, that you were aware that there was no other recourse. So here's the thing that, about partisanship, about why I'm so dedicated to an anti-partisan perspective. Because how we view these different rebellions, there's very few of us, I sense, that believe that armed rebellion is universally bad. I think, from the founding of this country, right, which was through armed rebellion against a government of overwhelming force, that was the legitimate government. From that founding of this country, we are trained from birth to believe that if something is so morally compelling and has no democratic means of being resolved, that ultimately you got to do what you got to do, right? I mean, that's what the American Revolution was all about. We were trying to get representation in Parliament. We didn't feel that a taxation system could be fair in a colonial system, et cetera, et cetera. We took up arms. We didn't keep holding on for a better court decision. We took up arms. That's what we did. We fundamentally could not end slavery by democratic means because the design of the Constitution had rendered that impossible. And so ultimately, after trying for several decades, we took up arms, right? We tend to not recognize that people with whom we disagree, who take up arms, are by and large taking up arms for that same reason, because there are things baked into our only semi-democratic constitutional processes that are keeping something they find morally compelling inaccessible, and unable to solve by any other means. And so, in desperation over that, as we have throughout our history, they come together in bands and resort to violence. And so, we probably have more disagreement between each other in the two principal encampments in this country, only on what would be appropriate terms where action like that could be justified, and not that action like that is unjustified, in all circumstances. We as Americans do not adhere to the Gandhi view. It was something that Dr. Martin Luther King tried to bring into the American consciousness, and to a large degree was successful in doing so, at least into our consciousness. And of course, that was responded to with extreme violence, with murder. Dr. Martin Luther King was killed. Violence was, and that violence, unfortunately, for the political philosophy of nonviolence being taught in such a widespread way by Dr. Martin Luther King and his movement in general, is that that act of violence did succeed, and it succeeded with great haste. The civil rights movement pretty much ground to a halt. The two things that Dr. King was working on in the final year of his life, which was anti-militarism and anti-poverty, because he felt anti-racism could progress no further without addressing those two core issues and those two areas of massive American expenditure and denial of livelihood. Those movements, also effectively ended with his death. And so, as Americans, we are left as eyewitnesses to history with this lingering debate. There is always a compelling historic case just to look at it through the rearview mirror to see that the violent methods have generally been preferred in American culture and have been successful more frequently and more rapidly than the nonviolent movements. Again, this not representing the taking of a position on my part. I personally, I'm a staunch advocate of nonviolence, and I'm just here basically recounting the actual history of what's happened in this country. So don't think that I'm advocating for violence, because quite the contrary. I'm only advocating for one thing here, which is a direct recognition that violence by small groups of people against government power has been the pattern in this country, and that it's succeeding has been the pattern in this country. And that's why we see it keep on happening, because that it's been successful is, of course, the incentive for it to continually be attempted, and that we built a constitutional system that basically prevents democratic processes from achieving many aims, and whether those aims are noble really dependent on which set of values you personally have. But that we did in fact build a system that's not very democratic, that prevents people from achieving their aims through democratic processes, which in turn also maintains a kind of a permanent incentive for violence to be attempted. So I'm going to return now to the 2000 election, the immediate aftermath of the 2000 presidential election, and specifically the matter of Florida, the vote count in Florida, the Supreme Court case, ultimately the seating of George Bush as president of the United States over Al Gore, and the role of the Brooks Brothers riot in bringing that about. And the reason I'm going to be talking about this right now is because it was not something in our ancient history. It was something that most of you who are alive today, and most of you who are listening or watching this broadcast, witnessed yourselves. And it is also potentially, it's hard to tell, where fraud may have been hidden over the course of our electoral history. Some say 1960 may have been an example of that in Illinois. And perhaps elsewhere. But in terms of us being able to bear witness to an act of violence against the vote counting process, actually producing the wrong president. It was 2000, the presidential elections, Florida, the Brooks Brothers riot, halting the count long enough for the counting date to pass. We found out a consortium of newspapers put in a Freedom of Information request to get the actual ballots, counted them afterwards, and found out that Gore had more votes, that it was in fact the stopping of the counting that created the wrong president. Starting in 2001, 8 years of a president who had factually lost the vote in that election, both the popular vote and the electoral college vote, establishes fact. Interesting, a couple of hundred people were rioting outside, threatening violence outside the counting house where that was happening. And then when the newspaper consortium demonstrated that Gore had actually won, the rest of us were just kind of like, yeah, okay, I guess. Nobody turned out into the streets. We love sitting there and watching people flood into the streets in their country. We loved watching the Arab Spring. We loved watching, when the election in Ukraine 20 years ago was being stolen, in the freezing cold, sub-zero temperatures, people surrounding the presidential palace. We love watching this stuff on TV in other countries. We love today, right now, we love watching Hong Kong. We know nothing about Navalny in Russia, but we love watching, the protests that are happening under his guidance and in his support. Here in our country, where we would supposedly rather die on our feet than live on our knees, we found out factually and very early on that the election had been wrongly decided and wrongly assigned. And we just shrugged and said, okay, better luck next time. That still fascinates me to this day. But there's something else I want to focus on about this. The capturing of the Florida election was something that happened in several stages. It was pre-planned. The staging of it was done substantially ahead of Election Day by purging a lot of people from the voter rolls and purging them on the basis of supposedly having a felony conviction, which in Florida meant you never get to vote. There's something we need to talk about, because in the 1990s, just before this election, who was it that created, hundreds of new categories of felonies targeted very carefully at Black Americans, and then produced the denial of their ability to vote in the aftermath of that? Of course, it was the Democrats, not the Republicans, who created those new felonies, who created the prison industrial complex through financing its creation. And the person who wrote the bill is the new president of the United States. We're eventually gonna find our way back to that in future episodes about how that is. But Florida tried to purge its voters, and they purged tens of thousands of people who never committed any felonies because their computer had been programmed to find people with close name matches. So the more common a name an actual convicted felon had, the more people got purged from the rolls and were unable to vote in that election. And yet, despite that effort, Al Gore was winning in Florida. The exit polls, which were accurate, reported he was the projected winner. Everybody was pretty much settled into congratulating Al Gore and getting ready to move on to the next segment of our lives, when suddenly there was an announcement made through, of course, the channel you would expect, through Fox News. Hey, wait, we're hearing that maybe the vote's not really going to Gore down in Florida. And so things were put on hold. There was then an organized violent rally built to descend upon the counting house. This rally was built not by people using message boards and using walkie-talkies. This was coordinated by the top brass of the Republican Party. Okay, Roger Stone was there. He'd been engineering these things since the days of Richard Nixon. He was still engineering them, in the days of Donald Trump. You all know the name Roger Stone. You all know what he looks like. He was involved in this. A congressman in New York named Sweeney in the area of Troy. The district's been adjusted a little bit, but I'm actually now in what was his district. John Sweeney was one of the organizers. They did things like putting out broadcasts on Spanish language radio listened to by the Cubans down in Florida, promoting the idea of a socialist takeover and that they needed everyone to turn out at the counting house and prevent this seizure of America by socialists. Same kind of message that you're still hearing now. Many of the people that were at the front of that violent rally were, the actual staff members of other Republican members of Congress. That's why it was called the Brooks Brothers Riot, because the cameras were showing a remarkable number of people who were dressed in, sport jackets, in blazers and button-down shirts. Just past the second quarter mark here at half an hour. I'm going to pause again for program ID. You are listening to or watching This Is Who We Are, a new public affairs commentary program from a nonpartisan and anti-partisan perspective. My name is Steve Greenfield. Thank you for being here. Subscribe to the channel. So the Brooks Brothers riot, right? They so frightened the people that were inside counting the votes that the vote count was suspended. While the vote count was suspended, a case came to Florida and then was appealed to the Supreme Court on the question, which was the same basis that the 1876 election had been held up by the red shirts who interrupted the counting in 3 southern states back at that time. That the premise was that the constitutional mandate that there was a fixed date, a fixed number of days elapsed between Election Day and the Electoral College meeting to actually create the new presidency, was of paramount importance, and not whether each state actually counted all their votes, and that the Constitution does seem to specify that the states themselves are responsible for deciding whether all of their votes had been counted. The Supreme Court, on a 5-4 partisan Republican versus Democrat basis, ruled to approve that. That was Bush v. Gore. That was its outcome. An interesting thing never pursued by the Democrats is that most of the people who were participating in this riot had crossed state lines to do so. There were Voting Rights Act provisions that were violated by this act. None of it, talk about holding people accountable, holding members of Congress accountable. My own former congressman was there leading it, held accountable. But the main thing to take away from this is that the Supreme Court supported this use of violence, validated that counting can be interrupted by any means, that it's on a state-by-state basis to announce whether they think they're done counting or whether they're just giving up and that they're running out of time. This should have been the starkest possible demonstration to the American people that voting is not really paramount in this country. It wasn't at the outset, right? At the beginning, we all kind of know, only white men with property were allowed to vote, right? And even within the context of that, their votes weren't necessarily counted in all kinds of elections, right? We had the Electoral College, which functioned in a much more direct way back then, electing the president so that the hoi polloi couldn't make a mistake from their lack of erudition on policy matters and pick a bad president. Or through some groundswell of populism, pick a bad president. The 2-seat per state Senate, the senators were chosen not by popular vote, but by their state legislators, by other partisan people that were already in government in their states, and not by vote at all. I think the amendment that changed that, we were already into the 20th century before we finally dropped that. So voting was never paramount as the principal means by which policy is made in this country. Popular voting by the people. the literal definition of democracy, was never paramount in this country, and it's still not. And now I'm going to sort of turn what happened in the aftermath of that. Rather than trying to contest the election definitely having been stolen from them, and stolen from them by an act of violence, the Democrats immediately started propagating this absolute myth that this happened because Ralph Nader got too many votes in Florida. Okay, here, now I'm getting to one of the most critical things of why I started this series, of why I care so deeply about the impact of myth on how we view things that we're seeing with our own eyes, and how the people with the most control over propagating myth, the people with the deepest pockets, the people with the greatest access to media, the people who are already in our consciousness as the people we trust and accept as leaders, that they are able to exploit this myth-making capacity to convince us that things that we saw with our own eyes are not what happened, and that things that could not possibly have happened are what happened, and then basically keep us as the tips of the spears of the game that keeps them in power and keeps the myth-making alive, and keeps us from ever being able to ever cast a vote that's truly in our own interest. Right? Each side of our divide accuses the other. What's wrong with them? Why aren't they voting in their interest? Voters are supposed to be rational. Those aren't rational voters. They're not. You know what? None of us are voting in our own interests. We're all settling. And even the idea of what is our own interest, right? If we believe in myths, then we believe that those things are our interest, that we're part of some collective, and that is the collective interest, and that as honorable people, we play a role in that. We don't even have honest discussions in our mainstream punditry in this country about how would we define voting in our own interests. Is that even a definable concept in the the big commercial media and privately financed political system that we have in this country? Because I would argue that we've never even sat down yet and had a discussion about how to define what voting in our own interest would even look like. So here we are, back to Florida 2000. Okay, Nader did it. It was Nader's fault. It was the Green Party's fault. The Democrats would have won, but not for the Green Party. This is ludicrous on the face of it, and in so many different ways. First of all, the most important reason why it's ludicrous is that we factually know that that Gore got more votes than Bush. That is factually established, like within 2 months of when Bush was sworn in. That was factually established. And with that factually established, there is no getting around the fact that the reason Bush became president is because the counting of the vote was stopped before it was finished. Not because somebody somehow subtracted votes from another candidate. That's a secondary ludicrous notion that we also have to touch upon and dispel. But for starters, we factually know that Gore got more votes. We factually know that the reason that he didn't get the electoral votes of Florida was because Florida stopped counting their votes before they were finished. We factually know that the reason they stopped counting their votes before they were finished is because Republicans were rioting and threatening their safety and banging on the doors and the windows and about to burst into the counting house. And the counters called for police protection to try to get them out of the counting house. And from that day forward, the counting was suspended while people were supposedly trying to figure out how to get it done safely. So those are the actual facts. And we know that, right? It was all on camera. We watched it live. We found out those are the facts. So why did the Democrats then set forth so aggressively in blaming this on Ralph Nader and the Green Party? And make sure that everybody joined together in trying to make sure that Green Party candidates can never get on a ballot, that you'll assist as best you can with your social media in telling people why we must never vote for minor party candidates, and how anybody who votes for minor party candidates is helping Republicans get elected. How did that happen so swiftly? More importantly, why did it happen? Why was that done when it flew in the face of what we had all witnessed on television, at the counting house, at the Supreme Court, and after the newspaper consortium had finished hand counting the actual paper ballots they had legally obtained through their Freedom of Information request? And I will tell you the reason. The reason is that what Ralph Nader was proposing with his campaign, and back then when it was still able to get 2.8 million votes, certainly a high growth, high popular growth goal that he was pursuing. He was unabashedly pursuing a handful of structural changes in how we engage in commerce in this country. This is Ralph Nader from the beginning, right? Back when everybody thought he was a hero in the 60s, that the forces of profit were designing cars that were death traps in which we could get killed. I mean, seriously, look back. The fact that our seats are bolted to the floors of our cars, even something that basic, is because of Ralph Nader's advocacy. The fact that we have airbags is because of Ralph Nader's advocacy. Seatbelts, that these ended up being required to be installed in cars as basic safety equipment. It was a structural change. Anybody old enough might remember exactly how, the big three car companies had private detectives following Ralph Nader around trying to catch him in an indiscretion of some kind. What an outrage that was, in its time. So Ralph Nader, after watching the Democratic Party become substantially Reaganite during the years of Bill Clinton, banking safety regulations ended in 1998. And we all saw how that worked out, by 2008. So much being undone, labor gains, racial equality gains, so many things were being undone, public safety gains. And so Ralph Nader, who was no longer welcome in the halls of Congress and among so-called liberal legislators, decided to make this statement, right? That's the setup of how this happened. In the aftermath of seeing violence put the wrong president in power, the Democrats decided that what was more important for this country going forward was the prevention of structural change. They would rather see people believe that it was okay for violence to overturn an election because there wasn't anything structural on the line between Al Gore and George Bush. There definitely were some social things, but nothing structural about the way our commerce operates, about the way our fundamental systems of intertwined business and government operate. That none of that was under any threat. Whereas what Ralph Nader was trying to promote was a potential restructuring, and if that were allowed to become more and more popular and to win elections, that the absolute power of the existing commerce structure in this country could be altered, that an unfortunate message could go out to the American people that we were capable of altering this structure nonviolently and through ordinary electoral means. And this was a message that the organized commercial and establishment political systems of this country did not want catching on. And so they chose instead to send out a message that it was an electoral rebellion, a peaceful electoral democratic rebellion whose crime was seeking votes on not on tribal insult hurling, but literally in the most refined manner possible, on the strength of its policy proposals and what those policy proposals could do for us as self-interested voters, if we came to recognize that we can be self-interested and that an option can be created in which we can vote accordingly. This was the thing that was not allowed to catch on, that an entire national election could be overturned by violence. That was okay, because all that was being overturned was who won the election, not anything structural about the United States. And of course, my contention, I'm sure many people out there, your contention, you understand, it was certainly Dr. Martin Luther King's contention in the last year of his activism in which he got killed, where he explicitly said, that he's changing the nature of his advocacy to the three evils instead of just concentrating on racism, because he had recognized that he had gone as far as he could on racial advocacy and that the rest was being held back by systemic poverty and systemic militarism. He was making that move. So that's why he was killed, right? We used violence to kill him, to keep that message from being propagated by peaceful means. Our system is violent. How dare we criticize small bands of people who are angry that they can't accomplish their goals through democratic means, when the system itself preserves itself through a combination of violence and denial of access to the machinery of democracy, to people who would attempt to use peaceful means and electoral means to give people the option to pursue their own interest without violence. So how do you fix all that? How do you fix this problem, right? That a violent rebellion unquestionably overturned the results of democracy and installed the wrong president, while at the same time there had been a very token and very minor, electoral attempt to bring public attention by getting into the media, right? Because people who wanted to have these conversations no longer had access to the media, as we always had in generations before Bill Clinton. Public interest advocates could get on television easily. Ralph Nader was a household name, feared, and spoken about his name inspired fear at corporate board meetings, because of the power of his word to steer democratic processes towards regulating what they were doing with their commerce. How did it become so easy to flip Ralph Nader into an enemy of the people, into an enemy of the United States, into the person who somehow made George Bush the president, instead of the thing we should have been observing and caring about and resisting with all our strength, which is that a small band of violent people had overturned that election and installed the wrong president and empowered that president to appoint Supreme Court justices, to support cabinet officials, to basically direct the entirety of American policy through election theft that was fomented through acts of violence. Like, isn't that what we want to know about? It seems, if you're watching TV right now, that's all we want to know about. Why are we knowing about it now? We're knowing about it now because right now the Democrats won and they're in charge, right? To the victor goes the spoils. So now the Democrats are able to speak openly about how violence is something we really need to focus on, hold people accountable for, prevent from ever happening again, believe in this mythology that this isn't who we are, that this is some kind of aberration. And since it's an aberration, we can just stop it. We can stop it from ever happening again by holding everybody accountable. Whereas in 2000, they lost. The people in charge of that access and those processes, those legal processes, the bully pulpit, were the people who had successfully stolen the election. And so the Democrats were faced with a hard choice. Do we try to, do we risk people rising up in resistance against this by being clear with them of what actually happened, which they'll accept when we say it because they saw it happen with their own eyes. It's not going to require any convincing. And not knowing, how do you contain that? How do you channel that? What could happen? Like the nervousness about that, to some degree, I'm going to acknowledge was legitimate. What would happen? Did we really want to see an Arab Spring in our country? Did we really want to see the American Revolution? Did we really want to see John Brown's rebellion? Undoubtedly, that was the conversation that was happening. Amongst the Gore team and at the DNC about how to handle this, this ugly reality that had just unfolded. So instead, they were able to find something else that wasn't visible but could become visible if it were manufactured and made visible to everyone in a coordinated way. And so they said, look how much we lost by. Of course, they didn't lose, right? Lie number one, they didn't lose, they won. Look how much we lost by. And then look how many votes that guy over there got. And if we'd gotten those votes instead of that guy, then none of this ever would have happened. And so there's the problem. There's the problem. That guy, those people, those votes. Why anybody would believe that those votes somehow automatically become our votes if that person weren't there I don't know how that became a convincing argument to anybody. Numerous polls showed that that was not the case, that those votes would have divided up amongst multiple other candidates, including George Bush. Don't think that that's so unbelievable, because close to 2 million Bernie Sanders primary voters voted for Donald Trump in 2016, because they weren't liberals. They weren't voting for Bernie Sanders because they just thought he was a superior liberal to Hillary Clinton. They were people who were dissatisfied with the system and wanted structural change, just like the people who voted for Ralph Nader. Those people were not going to default to a pro-system vote when they did that. And so that was a ludicrous assertion on the face of it, theoretically, as well as demonstrated through polls, through scientific polls. And yet, it's in a superficial kind of way, it made sense, because a lot of people that were voting for Democrats, they had past respect for Ralph Nader and the work he had done, and they believed that the Democrats were the party that produced the regulations that Ralph Nader was advocating. And so it was easy to access that combination of beliefs in their minds and make them believe that Nader was somehow being voted for because he was just a better or more pure version of what Democrats were trying to do anyway. And so in his absence, those votes would default back. But of course, that defies the whole premise of why Nader was running in the first place, which is that it had been too many years where he couldn't get a telephone call returned, that the Democrats were actually deregulating, and that the things that he was promoting that were structural, that were necessary for equality and for public safety and for peace and for improved democracy were things that could only be improved through better democracy, through more access to democracy, through more choices, through more candidates, for people recognizing better options and being willing to turn out in greater numbers to vote. Now, of course, there's a disconnect in this. There is a disconnect in believing that Ralph Nader caused the loss of Florida in 2000, in believing that Jill Stein caused Donald Trump to defeat Hillary Clinton in 2016, to believe that there could have been a conspiracy between Vladimir Putin and Jill Stein to do this, and that the proof of that is that she attended a 10th anniversary press banquet for a Russian media outlet at which Putin was also present and working the room, as political leaders do, in a scenario like that. But this flies in the face. This is cognitive dissonance. This is so paradoxical in the face of what liberal Americans believe when they see the exact same things happening in the American press about dissidents in other countries. When we look at American press coverage of Hong Kong, we don't see of dissidents in Hong Kong. We don't see American conspiracy to alter the course of elections in Hong Kong. When we see coverage of Navalny in Russia right now, all we see is coverage of dissidents in a foreign country. We don't imagine that this is meddling in that country's elections. Everywhere that we see this happening around the world in the foreign press, and in our press rather, covering overseas dissident movements, we don't interpret that as work by the American government, and when our own political leaders speak about Russia, we're going to wag our finger at you. Joe Biden's going to say some unkind words about your absence of democracy. We're going to say some unkind words about how China is treating Hong Kong. We don't see that as our politicians lending their force behind manipulating political processes in those other countries. We cheer for that. We're glued to our seats. We watch it. As if we're watching something important and heroic. And yet, when an American dissident was covered by a foreign power and responded to an invitation to express her happiness at having been covered as a dissident and went to their anniversary, suddenly that became proof that she and Vladimir Putin were conspiring specifically to help Trump, that was where the conspiracy happened. The overwhelming majority of Democratic Party voters actually believe this, even as they sit glued to their own televisions, watching their own Democratic Party leaders lecture Vladimir Putin about how he's mistreating Navalny and the followers of Navalny. And so I don't understand this, because, well, I mean, I do understand it, right? That's what we're here talking about today, is the power of myth. The power of myth, why myth exists, why it's effective, its purpose throughout the course of history, from the very founding of myth to this very day, is to exploit, for good and bad reasons and anything in between, this unique capacity that we have as human beings, among all the species of the world, to act in concert, to work in concert for a common purpose built on the sense of having a common identity. That's the function that mythology has always served, right? Nation states are built around their mythology. The United States is built around its mythology. The Boston Tea Party, George Washington could never tell a lie. All of these things that we come to believe, right? This is how the system has worked since the dawn of civilization. This is, in fact, how it became possible to move from being hunter-gatherers into becoming civilizations. So we know this process. It's amply studied academically, and it works so effectively that we can't see the effect it's had on us, on how we have acquired identity and place that identity ahead of critical thinking processes. That we lapse into tribalism so readily, so swiftly, even as we are trained in critical thinking, even as we have a sheaf full of diplomas and a career in business to indicate that we're outstanding critical thinkers. There are places that are reached in a more elemental and emotional level where we deny critical thinking access. And politics is definitely one of those areas. Surely we can see that in evidence now, as we've seen it, throughout our history. We are not more divided than we ever were. I'm coming into the close of this episode. We have so much more to talk about. But the central theme that we're working on here is that there is nothing special about this time. We are not more divided than ever before. We do not have partisan media more than ever before. We do not have actions promulgated on the wings of information from that partisan media and partisan politicians than ever before. It's all pretty much running on schedule. It's all pretty much running exactly as it has since the founding of this country, and producing the exact same result for which it was defined, which is that we don't change systemically. That's the one thing we don't do. This mythology is designed to protect the systems. The mythology convinces us that the systems are somehow noble or even godlike, and that the people who created them are godlike, smarter than us, better than us, had much more information and ingenuity in their possession, argued about it more effectively, and created. This is myth. This is all the myth, right? These were just all people who were really serving their own interests, right? They were the white property-owning men who allowed themselves to vote and nobody else. So we're going to close now. I'll see you next week. Steve Greenfield, this is who we are. Thanks for listening in. Like the Facebook page, subscribe to the YouTube channel, tell all your friends. I always run out of time. We're going to have so much more to talk about. See you next week. Thanks.